Good evening, everybody. My name is Father Ephraim Reese. I'm a Dominican friar. I work for the Thomistic Institute, and very happy to be with you all here tonight at St. Charles. We're very grateful to Father Planty and the St. Charles community, the only Thomistic Institute chapter that is not at a university, I believe. So he's proud to own it. And so the Thomistic Institute, if you have never been to an event or heard of us before, is an intellectual outreach of the Dominican House of Studies. So the Dominican friars were founded to preach the gospel and save souls through the charism of truth. Pretty broad, and it has been specified in some ways, but we are a Thomistic inclined group that is open to many other forms of truth, especially modern science, classical political philosophy, all kinds of good stuff. So I just want to tell you about a couple Thomistic Institute events that are on the horizon in the area. So for one, we have what is called an intellectual retreat coming up. That's May 7th through the 9th. That'll be at the Washington Retreat House and the Dominican House of Studies, which is in Northeast DC. So it's especially for young adults, students involved in Thomistic Institute chapters, but anyone is welcome to apply. An intellectual retreat has our sort of normal form of serious academic lectures, but in the context of worship. So you'll be able to participate in the liturgy of the Dominican friars at the House of Studies. There'll be Mass and the prayer of the office, the liturgy of the hours, along with time for fellowship and eating and drinking. So that'll be about St. Augustine. It's called Grace and Peace, St. Augustine as Spiritual Master. And the speakers are Father Andrew Hofer, who's a professor of historical and systematic theology at the House of Studies, as well as Professor Thomas Clemens, who's an Augustine scholar at Catholic University, also here in DC. So check it out, ThomisticInstitute.org. You can also look forward to Civitas Dei. So we have an annual conference called Civitas Dei, which means City of God, named after Augustine's famous work. This year's Civitas Dei is titled Art, Meaning, and the Public Square. It'll have Dr. Thomas Hibbs, Professor Philip Bess, and Father Reginald Lynch, who's the assistant director of the Thomistic Institute and teaches at the House of Studies as well. So that's June 13th through the 18th. And finally, a more global concern of the Thomistic Institute is Aquinas 101. So we've had success with a YouTube series introducing people to the thought of Thomas Aquinas, and we are directing our efforts now to a series on science and faith. So the Science and Faith series will launch its first video either very late tonight or sometime tomorrow, and the trailer is already available on YouTube, and you can go to aquinas101.com to subscribe, and we hope you will, and hope you'll spread the word to anyone who you think might benefit from an engagement between Catholic philosophers and theologians and also Catholic scientists who are eminent in their field, trying to simply show something which is basically obvious to most intelligent Catholics, but is not obvious to the world around us, the deep harmony of contemporary science with the Catholic tradition, with Christian belief in God. Okay, so without further ado, let me introduce to you our speaker tonight, Dr. R.J. Snell. He is the editor-in-chief of Public Discourse and the director of academic programs at the Witherspoon Institute. Previously, he was for many years the professor of philosophy and director of the philosophy program at Eastern University and the Templeton Honors College, where he founded and directed the Agora Institute for Civic Virtue and the Common Good. He earned an MA in philosophy at Boston College and a PhD in philosophy at Marquette University. His research interests include the liberal arts, ethics, natural law theory, Thomas Aquinas, the Catholic intellectual tradition, and the work of Bernard Lonergan, a Jesuit Thomist. Snell is the author of Through a Glass Darkly, Bernard Lonergan and Richard Rorty on Knowing Without a God's Eye View, Authentic Cosmopolitanism with Steve Cohn, and The Perspective of Love, Natural Law in a New Mode, among other publications. He and his family reside in the Princeton area, so we thank him for traveling down to DC for this fine in-person event. And with that, I'll give you Dr. R.J. Snell speaking on the human person, community, and communion.
Thank you so much, Father. Is that too loud? Okay, you're fine. Thank you so much, Father. It's very grateful to be with you at the Thomistic Institute and indeed here at St. Charles. It took a few tries to get this to work out. I think this was the third attempt, with the other two attempts being canceled for various COVID reasons. So it's a real treat to finally be with you. And thank you so much to all of you for finding time to join us. How I wish that the Thomistic Institute was around when I was a young student. When I was young, I used to find the following story embarrassing, and now I just find it funny. So I had studied no philosophy at all as an undergraduate, and I went to Boston College because I wanted to study with Peter Kraft. And I heard that he was teaching a course on Thomism. I didn't know Thomism from anything. In fact, because I had been a communications and rhetoric major as an undergrad, I thought it was a course on the theory of Stephen Toulmin, which is kind of a logician. So I show up for class the first day ready to argue about arguments and warrants, and I hear this line from this guy, Thomas Aquinas. I have no idea who that is, and I'm a young Baptist at the time, that grace perfects nature. And my life has never been the same because of that line, because grace does in fact perfect nature. If you know the Thomistic Institute, I hope you support their work. They're very good. The human person, community, and communion. The 2015 release of Submission by the French novelist Michel Houellebecq turned out to be something of an event, in no small part because the English translation, which fictionalizes the political rise of the Muslim Brotherhood in the France of 2022, happened to be published, or at least translated into English, on the very same day of the Charlie Hebdo shooting. Houellebecq followed up with some incendiary comments about Islam, and there was a perfect storm of controversial PR. Now, few of the reviewers seem to note that Submission really wasn't so much about Islam, but was rather about the collapse of France itself, which, as the home of both Descartes and Voltaire, Foucault, and Derrida, is something of the symbol of modernity and postmodern thought. In Submission, the novel, we find less a warning about Islam and more of a funeral oration for the contemporary West. Now, the protagonist, a not so subtly named Francois, France itself, is a professor of literature. He's not particularly accomplished. Neither does he regard his profession very highly, claiming, and I'm just going to quote throughout here without indicating what I'm quoting, claiming that the academic study of literature leads basically nowhere. Still, he continues, it's harmless in the main and can even have a certain marginal value for sales clerks at high-end boutiques for whom the study of literature carries positive connotations. Francois identifies himself with those gifted few, those who have the coveted promise of being a senior lecturer. Now, those of you in the academy know that tenure is the golden apple. One is the gifted few if you attain it. Yet Francois says that he never felt the slightest vocation for teaching, bemoaning that his 15 years as a teacher had only confirmed his initial lack of a vocation. Worse, his experiences with students taught him that he didn't like young people. Being young implied an enthusiasm for life, a feeling that Francois never had. With respect to scholarship, the prospect in his word is cold and exhausting. For me, nothing mattered except which dinner I'd microwave while I watched the political talk shows on France 2. Now, a similar failure of enthusiasm carries over to Francois' personal life. Relationships are entirely ephemeral and pointless, a succession of girlfriends and hookups, each of them passing and unsatisfying. Of the now progression in his idea of serial monogamy headed towards the formation of a family, he has unreserved scorn. It is, he says, complete idiocy. Commitment and the heritage of children have no attraction for him at all. They're so irrelevant as to be not even rejected, simply not considered. Now, in the novel, he doesn't participate in the political turmoil. The Muslim Brotherhood is coming into power in France. All he does is open up a British bank account to keep his money safe and then heads off to the French countryside. It's the move, he says, of a rat abandoning ship. But rats are intelligent animals, he says. And so he heads for the southwest of France for no particular reason, since he says he didn't actually know very much about France. He had never really visited this country that he was, theoretically, a citizen of. Now, while great political turmoil shakes the country, Francois spends his time in the hotel room, watching TV and bemoaning, as a good modern person would, slow Wi-Fi connection. At last he remembers that Huysmans, who's the study of his own research, had converted to Catholicism. And so Francois heads to a medieval citadel hosting a famous Madonna, the so-called Black Virgin of Rocamadour. There he stays on and off for almost a month, habitually visiting the chapel of Our Lady. Of the statue, he writes, it's very strange. The same one who for 1,000 years had inspired so many pilgrimages, before whom so many saints and kings had knelt, it bore witness to a vanished universe. He spends the last day of his reveries before the Virgin, almost indicating a chance for renewal and retrieval for Francois, for France, before what he understands to be the beating heart of French Christianity, this ancient center of faith, of passions both natural, like national and patriotic pride, and supernatural, for redemption and for everlasting life. Before the statue, Francois hears a call to repent and to return, like the prodigal son, not just Francois the individual, but France itself. Western culture could come home to Our Lady. In place of pornography and microwave dinners, anime and hookups, time wasting in television, will he accept hope and love? He won't. Even though he experiences something of a mystical vision, in which it seemed that the Virgin was rising from her pedestal and growing in the air, Francois rationalizes. Maybe I was just hungry. Maybe I'd forgotten to eat. And what I should probably do is go back to the hotel and have a few duck's legs, which he does, and he packs his car and he departs. The Virgin, he says, has power, but little by little, I felt her moving away from me in space and time and across the centuries while I sat there. I got up, fully deserted by the Spirit, reduced, and sadly descended the stairs to the parking lot. Now, Francois lives in what Charles Taylor has described as a disenchanted world. For us moderns, the cosmos is no longer full of spirits and gods, fairies and forms, but only causal forces which we harness to our own needs. Now, while this allows for unprecedented technical and economic progress, it leads, in the words of Taylor, to a wide sense of malaise at the disenchanted world, a sense that the world is flattened, empty, lacking meaning or purpose. Now, for Taylor, this is true even for those moderns who retain faith. Everyone, Taylor says, even religious believers, inhabit the world of what he calls the immanent frame, things reduced to immanence. It's a way of living in a self-sufficient immanent order, bereft of transcendence, or at least a certain sort of transcendence. Such enframing, Taylor says, makes possible a vision of what he calls exclusive humanism, which accepts no final goals beyond human flourishing, nor any allegiances to anything beyond this flourishing. Now, of course, flourishing is defined in a reductive way. There really is, in that world, nothing more than the next iPhone and the returns promised for economics, medicine, health, and social well-being. Now, in that picture, the contemporary West, at least as fictionalized by Willebeck, is trapped within the immanent frame and is thus an anti-culture. Not simply a bad or an inadequate culture, but an anti-culture which works against the human vocation. The immanent frame, which attempted to, quote-unquote, save the human things from the divine and the supernatural, instead replaces the natural and the supernatural things with technological reductions. In the end, it ends up jettisoning human flourishing for mere comfort and power. As we submit ourselves to forces and processes, we lose form, and the great institutions in which men and women live out their lives and become fully authentic, education, family, politics, religion, they become increasingly enervated, decadent, decayed, and moldering away, like our souls. I have a 16-year-old daughter who once found an article I had written which said, "Things are not as bad as you think, they're worse." And every time I give a talk like this, she leans in and says, "Hey, Dad, things are not as bad as you think, they're worse." 16-year-olds, who can reason with them? Now, in a review of Willebeck, Mark Lilla of Columbia suggests that Willebeck is articulating not only the immanent frame, not just the world which is reduced without the supernatural, but also the isolation of the contemporary individual. Do a Google search for the words loneliness and epidemic, and soon you'll discover how alone people are in our society, with many reporting having not any friends that they think of as genuine friends. And this was before lockdowns and quarantines. Think how bad it is for many now. It's far, far worse. But as Francois suggests, that he's not really a citizen of France, Lilla suggests in his own book, The Once and Future Liberal, that we have lost all sense of what it means to be bound up in a common project as citizens and as a nation. As he puts it, Lilla, the old liberal dispensation, that of FDR, had as its image two hands shaking. But the new dominant image, Lilla says, is a rainbow, a prism which refracts a single beam of light into its constituent colors. That is, out of one, many, rather than the older hope, out of many, one. In doing so, Lilla says, there is no sense of we or citizenship. Instead, this is Lilla's words, we've become hyper-individualistic and bourgeois, materially and in our cultural dogmas. Almost all the ideas or beliefs or feelings which muted or softened the old perennial American demand for individualism and autonomy, the old checks on that have all but evaporated. What's left is thin or atomistic. Lilla says, personal choice, individual rights, self-definition. We speak these words as if a wedding vow. We hear them so often that it is hard for us to think or talk about any subject except in these self-regarding terms. It's an image, he says, referring to another Willebeck novel, of elementary particles spread out in space, each rotating at its own speed and following its own trajectory. I find that a powerful image. Elementary particles, each spread out in space, rotating in its own space and going in its own trajectory. Now, against that rather gloomy and glum image, there are certain truths of the Catholic faith. They're truths, so they're always true. They've always been true. And yet their needfulness is perhaps especially acute just now. As the West creaks and groans farther along into post-Christianity, it neglects or truncates these truths, upon which the West depends for its basic cultural forms. But as the form loses the spirit, or if you'd like me to be a slightly better Thomist, as the matter loses its form, it's unsurprising that the West becomes more and more Willebeckian, isolated, deracinated, atomistic, fragmented, and alienated. Now, what I'd like to suggest for your consideration this evening is that the Christian understanding of the person is a truth desperately needing to be rediscovered, reappropriated, and rearticulated for our time. Now, one can, of course, give a direct definition of the person. The person is an individual substance of a rational nature. That's true. I don't deny it. And yet, at the same time, that definition is not especially evocative. But perhaps you'll give me a few moments to explore the idea of persons a bit more with you. Years ago, when I was at Boston College, I was a young Protestant, and I happened to have the good fortune of being in a study group with Peter Kraft and Tom Howard and some others. And I was working in the library with a nun from Mother Teresa's order, and she invited me to lunch once. Fine, I go to lunch, and there's a Jesuit waiting for me. She'd set me up. She told me once that she was praying for my conversion, and then she leaned into me and she said, "My prayers are always answered." One weekend, I came to work at the library, and she said, "I went to New York, I went to St. Pat's, and I went to St. Elizabeth Ann Seton. so it's all but guaranteed now that you'll enter the church. Okay, so here I am, here's this Jesuit, and he says to me, remember I'm a young Protestant, he says, what's the most important truth of the Christian faith? And I thought I was being rather clever, and I said, justification by faith alone, very sort of bucky and argumentative. And he looked at me and he said, no, it's the Trinity. The Trinity is, of course, the most important doctrine of the faith. It's the doctrine of the faith in some ways. Let's think about persons through the lens of the Trinity. There's nothing new here. And yet, it's incredibly evocative to think about persons through the lens of the Trinity. 3 persons in one being. The Father is not the Son is not the Holy Spirit is neither the Father nor the Son, and yet they are all equally God and share equally in the Godhead, without any of them being reduced to being not God. And yet, the story goes beyond this. It's not just simply that they have an identity as God in the Godhead. There's also a distinction of relations between the 3. The Father begets, the Son is begotten, and the Holy Spirit is spirated between the begetter and the begotten. St. Bernard has a lovely example. The Father is the one who kisses, the Son is the one who is kissed, the Holy Spirit is the kiss itself. Now, when you hear the idea of the Father being begetter and the Son being begotten, it's easy enough to imagine. You shouldn't imagine it, you shouldn't hold it, but it's easy enough to imagine why Arius would think that the Son is somehow less than the Father. The Father begetting seems like creating. Being begotten seems something like being created. You can imagine why Arius would perhaps think of the Son as not being equivalent with the Father. But for this, the Father gives in such a fashion that even though the Son receives, the normal economy that we have between individuals, where the one who gives is greater than the one who receives, is not true. You've had this experience, I'm sure. I have. It's Christmas, and someone shows up with a gift that you were not anticipating receiving, and they hand you a gift, sometimes an especially generous gift. You know that horrible feeling when you have to say or admit, I have nothing for you? Now, on the one hand, you might feel incredibly loved, yes? What is the other possible alternative when someone gives you a gift you were not anticipating, especially if it was a remarkably generous gift? Shame, diminishment, obligation, or worse even, resentment. Because in our understanding, to give is to have a certain power over the other. But the Father loses nothing in the giving. It's not as if the Godhead is 100 units, and the Father gives some away and now has less, and the Son receives some units and now is sort of receiving what he did not always already have, the Godhead, and is somehow dependent upon the Father. They are co-eternally and co-equally God. Their personal relationship, their relation as persons, is gift and receipt that does not diminish the giver or diminish the receiver. In fact, so perfect is the giving and the receipt and the offering back of praise and love that the offering back and forth, speaking somewhat loosely there, is the Holy Spirit itself. In other words, persons in the Trinity are not simply individuals who exist as substances who might enter into relations with each other. To be persons is to be relational. And it's to be for relation, and it is to have perfection in relationship itself. In fact, in the Godhead, it is the relationship which is their form, which is their perfection. Now we, created in the image and likeness of God, learn something about ourselves, which is, as persons, we are not simply individuals who might then enter into relationship if we so choose. We are always already from a communion, the communion of the Trinity, meant and ordered towards communion. Persons are for relations. Now, the second image here is that which is, I think, articulated so beautifully by John Paul II in his Theology of the Body. Many of you will be familiar with this work. Forgive me for telling you what you already know. But I find this text entrancing and intriguing, and I never tire of speaking of it. Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. God creates the world in Genesis 1. We have things created according to their kind. Things are put into space, or things are separated rather into their proper place. And then each of those things are filled. So we have separation and then filling. Form and matter, if you like, in a certain sense. And God declares in that beautiful poetry, he speaks it, it is good. He speaks it, it is good. He speaks it, it is good. And then we have that remarkable statement that God makes, not Adam, that it is not good for Adam to be alone, not good for man to be alone. There's something jarring in this story. Things are good, things are good, things are good, things are very good, and then suddenly they're not good. Why are they not good? Well, you know the story. They're not good because Adam is alone, the man is alone. And what is he meant for? Well, he's meant for communion. He's created in the image and likeness of God, as is Eve. In Genesis 1, we're told that God created them in his image, male and female, he created them. But then it is not good for Adam, for the man, to be alone. Why? Does he not have a kind of communion with God? God has made him, after all. We're given images of Adam later walking in the cool of the afternoon with God in the garden. Is that not sufficient? Now, Adam's alone. He's clearly metaphysically an individual. We can identify him as this one. He's not that one or that one or that one. The evidence of this, of course, is the parade of animals. And God says it is not good for him to be alone. Now, John Paul II reads this as a kind of awakening of conscience, or an awakening of consciousness, really, for Adam. God is teaching Adam that he is alone and not like the others. Now, you remember the story. The animals are paraded by, sort of a strange, beautiful scene. I like to imagine it poetically, not literally, but sort of poetically. Adam is waiting in great expectation, right, to find his helper. Here comes the giraffe, and Adam's slightly confused. It's a very long neck. Off it goes. Here comes another one. It's the zebra, very stripy. It's sort of like youth events at St. Charles Borromeo as you look around and everybody hears a zebra, everybody hears a giraffe. Where's the one for me? Here comes the platypus. Good, nice joke, God. God was... Now, in the story, you have to imagine that God is eliciting a kind of desire and awakening, and maybe even a growing consciousness of Adam being alone. None of these are right for me. Think of that very powerful experience. None of these are right for me. And the corresponding sense of maybe I am not right for any of these. Adam can do nothing about it. God puts him to sleep. The rib is taken. In that biblical passage, perplexing the young people forever as they count ribs and wonder what's going on. He awakens. There she is. And what does he cry out? At last, bone of bone and flesh of flesh. One like me, one for me, and one for whom I am. Adam is also made for communion. In fact, what it means to live well is to have a kind of capacity for self-gift, to give to the other and to be able to receive their gift in return. Adam is being taught that he is, in fact, in the image of the Trinity, being for relation. He is not merely an individual. He's not merely one instance of the species individuated by matter. He is a person and thus made to always go beyond and outside of himself, to have presence to another and for the other to have presence to him. And of course, very soon in the biblical text, we're told that he knows her and she conceives. They are made for relation. The communion of persons is, in fact, some aspect of human flourishing and some aspect of human well-being. We're made for communion. Now, I'm articulating this because I think it's important to get the person right. We tend to think of the person as an individual who has a kind of sovereignty over herself, who then, from that position of sovereignty, chooses to enter into relation or others. And that's true insofar as it goes. But more profoundly than that, we're not merely individuals, but persons who are already made for that communion and who are called to it, beckoned to it, for whom the other elicits that desire of communion for them. It's important to get the theory right, to understand what we really are in our humanity and to live accordingly. I think the Trinity and the theology of the body help us with that. However, I'd like to suggest as well that our teaching and instruction on these matters cannot remain solely at the level of the theoretical. I'm a philosopher. I'm supposed to say, sure, it works in practice, but does it work in theory? But I'd like to suggest instead that we move beyond the instruction of the theory of the person and wonder how to embody that teaching in our common lives. Now, I'm not in any way suggesting a competition between theory and practice. We need both. We need to do both well. But I do think that we have a unique opportunity, perhaps because of COVID lockdowns and loneliness, but also in part because of the larger story of the West playing itself out, if Willebeck is correct, if Mark Lilly is correct, of isolation and an inability to have a disposition towards communion. Trapped in the isolation of ourselves as individuals, we need to teach a better way. It seems to me, or I suggest for you, that many of our peers, given the current cultural deformation, have a hard time seeing what's good, even when it's there. According to Joseph Pieper, one of my favorite authors, our eyes have gone dim. We struggle to see reality as good, as wonderful, as joyous. Not, says Pieper, because our physiological sense is impaired, we can see, but rather the very integrity of human existence is threatened by what he calls a kind of existential poverty. Our society is not in the main materially impoverished, but we are spiritually impoverished, or many are, existentially impoverished. We have thick wallets, but thin souls, starving souls, because we exist in the immanent frame. We need to become enriched ourselves and to help others be led into a way of existential richness, a way which is disposed to communion, which is that for which we exist. But there's a sort of catch-22 for many people. Being spiritually impoverished, many of us do not see that communion would be a good thing. And until we have a taste of communion, we cannot become existentially rich enough to desire it. So here are a few suggestions, some concrete practices that may be of assistance as we attempt to show a better way of community and communion itself, the communion of persons. First, keep the Sabbath. In fact, all my suggestions are really Sabbath suggestions. Things we could do to recover Sunday as a day of communion, not merely rest or entertainment or play, but as a day which is a kind of communion, oriented by and disposed to communion in the Eucharist, and then the fecundity of the Eucharist pouring forth. Another way of putting it, parents and priests and friends ought to exert the full range of their intelligence and their will to make Sunday a day of richness and fecundity, rather than just a day of catching up on shopping or laundry. Second, study and story, especially on Sundays. The reading of good books, especially spiritual reading, has made more than a few saints. But we tend not to study as much as we should. During a time in which many cannot see, it's possible that they must become gradually accustomed to the light. And so, we should read books which bring life to souls. Sometimes those souls are little, either as children or just because they are young in their progress or young in their journey, and they need to grow. And sometimes souls have a kind of blindness. In the Sunday reading, men love darkness rather than light, and they need to learn to see and to approve and to love the light as it is. Or maybe sight is the wrong metaphor. Maybe taste is a better one. Many of us need to develop the taste for the true and the lovely. In fact, there's a reason to think that the Latin word for wisdom, sapientia, shares a root with the word for taste, such that to have wisdom is to have a taste for the right things. So maybe the first and most important gift we can give to those we love is a kind of taste, a wisdom to apprehend what is good, maybe perhaps especially by drawing upon the emotions, well-formed, educated, reasonable emotions. And those emotions tend to be formed by stories and images and symbols, and the faith has been so good at this. Now, such taste doesn't come from argument or theory in the end. You know that old saying, it's a cliche by now, but it's still a good saying, that Waterloo was won on the plain fields of Eton. Meaning, of course, that the virtues given to young men at play determined the ability they had to govern themselves at war and at government. During the battle itself, there's no time to reason, to think, to ponder, to debate. You have to act. And you have to act from a firm and stable disposition, one that you already have. As Aristotle rightly teaches, it's in the beginning that so much depends upon. In fact, the beginning doesn't just make some of the difference, it makes all the difference, for habits and tastes shape so much of what we will do when it counts. You probably know the line from C.S. Lewis in The Abolition of Man, he's sort of riffing off Plato, the tripartite soul there. Lewis, as the king governs by his executive, so reason in the man must rule the mere appetites by means of the spirited element. The head rules the belly through the chest, of emotions organized by trained habit into stable sentiments. The chest, magnanimity, sentiment. These are the indispensable liaison officers between cerebral man and visceral man, he says. Now, appetites, as you may know, I've been told this, I haven't experienced this, are powerful and tricky things, dangerous in fact. And before you realize it, appetites can be governing your life. But the person who has spirit, thumos, is able to be disappointed or even angry at the very idea of acting shamefully. That person is the one most capable of acting and living well over the long haul. And so the books we choose for ourselves, the books we would read to our children and friends, grandparents on a Sunday afternoon, those are the sorts of books which teach us how to love and what sorts of things are lovely. Naughty Peter Rabbit, the moral heroes and villains in Plutarch, stories of King Alfred, brave little toy canoes that make their way downstream in a journey to the sea, persistent turtles in Aesop. Those are tales and stories which are alive, not merely in the sense of being interesting, but they teach us how to go about living well. In the end, a bookish life is not so much about knowing books so much as it is about living well. We shouldn't try to be pedants, but rather persons. And the point is to live well, not merely to be well-read. Now, if Sabbath is first and study and story is second, then my third suggestion would be beauty. One of the great fractures of contemporary society is its loss of beauty. And perhaps no society within our larger culture has experienced this loss more abruptly than Catholics, whose traditions of architecture, art, and sacred music was broken in a great calamity. It's no accident that film and television tend to portray religion, either good or bad, as Catholic. And it's no accident that the Catholicism that they love to portray is the Catholicism of chants, polyphony, stained glass, Gothic architecture, votive candles, Caravaggio, St. Peter's. Because one notices these things, they strike us as being shocking or notable or even awful. Now, too often the word beauty implies a certain snobbishness. I don't intend that. We're not hoping to have a kind of dilettantish smattering of cocktail party conversation about cave drawings, opera, and the hammered dulcimer. Those are all interesting things, of course, I guess. I don't know about the hammered dulcimer. Those other things are pretty interesting. But the real goal of beauty is to put us in touch with reality, with the deep, wondrous truth which beauty reveals, so that we can care about it. If goodness is being as it is desired, beauty is being as it causes delight. To have the beautiful is to have the world as a cause of delight. And when delighted, we attend. When delighted, we feel the call of reality, and it deepens and stretches and grows our little souls and accustoms our blind eyes to the light. Fourth, and in some ways, I would suggest the culmination of the first three, that at which they aim, the one that I really care about. I think that the fourth practice, which we ought to double down on and become really good at if we're not already, is feasting. Catholicism loves stuff, loves matter. It's a religion of water and wine and food. Salvation comes through bread, which is no longer bread. And our entire life is organized around a meal. The space of our churches is organized around the place of the meal. The old neighborhoods were organized around the churches and the place of the meal. Everything in our life, the source and summit of our life, is a meal. The great feast, the great celebration. It's no accident that when we feast, with the meaning of those feasts is a kind of extravagance, a kind of recognition of the magnanimity of God. Remember, a God who begets, who pours forth personhood as gift, and the sort of gift which spirates forth as the Holy Spirit, and the kind of person who continues to create and say that it is good. That's God. Now, when one feasts, one doesn't count the costs. You can't feast if you're counting pennies. One feasts because it is good to do. A feast is like training for the Eucharist, the training to be, with all due difference, like God who gives and delights in the gift, the training to have joy. Eucharist, in the end, is a celebration of communion. Eucharist just is communion. If we are made for communion, it is no accident that what God offers us every day is communion with Him through a feast. Nothing could be more fitting or appropriate to the nature of the triune God than to offer us something of the share of God's own inner life in a feast, an endless outpouring of gift, because that's what the divine person not just does, but is. Perhaps I need to put this all more directly. I'm suggesting that we need to outjoy our cultured despisers. Outjoy our cultured despisers. So our Sundays should be full of feasting, and especially feasts with dancing. Not the terrible, awful, isolating dance of the contemporary nightclub, but communal dancing. I want to be concrete here for a moment. You can do this at home. Find a friend. Aristotle, remember, has 3 sorts of friends: friends of pleasure, friends of use, and friends of the good. Find a useful friend, one who plays the piano, someone who plays the violin, someone who knows how to play, of all things, the accordion. I don't know. Push back the couches and dance on a Sunday afternoon after Mass. Will you allow me, embarrassingly, to quote myself from something I wrote before? You have to, because I'm up here. Here's something I wrote before. It was an ironclad rule of the schools and religious communities of my youth that dancing was forbidden. A prohibition enforced with the same rigor as the edict to not drink, smoke, or chew, or go with girls who do. So I grew up not dancing, and I'm a terrible dancer. My children find me embarrassing when I dance. I have more enthusiasm than skill. Recently, at the time when I wrote this, my wife and some friends threw a party culminating in traditional line dancing. I'd not done that before, and I went to the party somewhat hesitant. But there we all were, jammed together in an overheated room, stamping and clapping, bowing and twirling to the fiddle and guitar. Mostly, though, we were exulting. I held my youngest daughter to her shrieking delight as her older sister and I do-si-doed and promenaded, and a triumphant son somehow convinced an older, quite pretty, partner to stoop down to him. Unlike other days, teenage boys could not escape their mother's arms, and I saw moms so jubilant and merry and relieved at this feat that they were paraphrasing Simeon, "Lord, now let your servant depart in peace." Grandfathers danced with granddaughters, husbands and wives, friends with friends. A few yearning adolescents with hearts beating time to another more ancient reel. In that sweltering, overcrowded room, you could hear the music and see us leaping, joined in circles, feet rising and falling in mirth, the association of men and women, holding each other by the hand or arm. I was, drunk with it, flushed of body and soul, delighted with the others, thrilled with reality. We were not, as I had feared, ironical or skeptical, but approving. We approved in the old sense of the term, in that we recognized goodness, probus, and we loved it, we willed it. We willed that it should be, that it should exist, that it should continue. In the handing off of one partner to the next, we handed on, traditio, the rhythms of the good reality that had preceded us, following the patterns long set down by others, and it was good. On another occasion, at a parish dance, I wrote this, quoting myself again. I was with several dozen members of my parish celebrating Oktoberfest, lederhosen and beer, a roasted pig, papa. My son was so proud, so manly, so roosterish as he led his older and younger sisters around the floor. Never mind that he knew none of the steps. Most strikingly, my youngest wove and bounced her way around, joining eyes and hands with other dancers somewhat willy-nilly. She did not care. Hers was a deep and childlike sense that all was well, all manner of things were well, and she could keep the feast. That's the way of affirmation. And it's not shallow optimism. It's not just a sense of, oh, we're having a nice time here. Nor does it deny the tragic. And still, festivity lives in approval. Even the feasts for the dead depend on the faith that all is well with the world in the end. What I'm suggesting is that we outjoy because we want to learn and pass on normalcy. We want to know, and our friends to know, our families to know, that spring flowers and public dancing are in fact educations and romance. We want that. We want that for ourselves and our friends. And we want them for no other reason than they're good. To celebrate good things as they are meant to be celebrated, alongside the trained and training eyes of parents and culture and a genuine cultural inheritance. I'm startled how often I talk to young people, being no longer young, I get to say such things. And how many of them tell me, I find this just a grievous wound, how many of them tell me that they feel like they've been robbed of their inheritance. By which I don't think they mean material inheritance or the estate of their grandparents. I think what they mean is they've been robbed of the cultural form which trains them to see the forms which had been there before and which taught a sense that all was well and things were good. But how are we going to learn to live, to love, to taste, to be wise, to enter into the deep, beating, ordered loveliness of a reality which, because it's from the triune God and depends at every moment on the triune God saying, yes, let it be, it is good. How are we going to discover the deep, ordered loveliness of that world, so beautiful as to astound, if we don't offer it? It is not going to be offered by the dreary anti-culture of our time, so ably summarized and fictionalized by Willebeck. The anti-culture would take all of that away. It would turn children into consumers, the innocent into the experienced. It would turn the wondering and delighted sense of things being good into the skeptical and the cynical. It turns persons into tools. This we reject because we believe that of all things in creation, only persons were willed for their own sake. This is the teaching of the faith. Of all the things in the created order, only persons were willed for their own sake. And to not understand that persons are made for communion with God, and that is good, is to miss the point of life. I'd like to ask you to consider how to offer community in an embodied way to your young nephews and nieces, your students, your parishioners, your friends. I'd ask that next Sunday, because of the Trinity, because God is who God is, that maybe you start small. Read some poetry aloud after lunch. Maybe make an old recipe you remember someone in your family cooking on Sundays. My father-in-law talks about Sunday gravy, Italian red sauce, that would be simmering on the stove as they left for Mass. Mass meant the Eucharist, but it also meant gravy, the good stuff, Sunday gravy, the best his mother had to offer. So Sunday left a good taste in his mouth. Do that. For the Sunday after that, plan a dinner party with friends, not to impress them, but to have a Sabbath feast. Turn off your TV that day. It's not worth watching the Washington football team anyway. Buy some good wine. Have some friends to dinner. Serve Sunday gravy. The Sunday after that, invite your priest over for dinner. Read the poetry, serve the good food. Perhaps sing a folk song or the Salve Regina after dinner. The Sunday after that, learn a new dance step. Best if you have live music. Make the Sabbath sing. Make it taste really good. Make Sabbath be like the way God is, generous and delightful. God in the Catholic understanding just is a community of love and joy. That is what God is, a communion of love and joy. He doesn't just have joy. He doesn't just have love. God is love. God is the endless, ceaseless, eternal outpouring of love. That's what the Trinity is. But we won't be able to recognize God as God is if we ourselves don't have a taste for joy and love, for generosity and hospitality, of community and communion. And our culture is not going to help us a whole lot. But Catholic culture has always been pretty good at this. So make Sundays Catholic so that you, your children, your friends can taste and see that the Lord is good. And to do so, you'll have to provide yourself and your friends a life vibrating with communion. You remember those great lines from Belloc? about Catholic life. Wherever the Catholic sun doth shine, there's always laughter and good red wine. At least I have always found it so. Benedicamus Domino. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Dr. Snell. We have time for some questions.
Wonderful, yeah. Grateful for your attention and happy for your questions or objections or comments, please.
Very fine talk. I'm just curious, Houellebecq has seen things so clearly. What do you know about him personally? Has he been on some journey where where he's come to?
I mean, he's a wild man. He's the terrible child of French literature, and the literature itself is fairly disturbing and disgusting. It's hard to recommend it, or even in some ways, I hesitate to even make reference to it because it is not pleasant literature. But he does seem to, I think, have understood that there has been a great loss, and that France, the eldest daughter of the Church, represents in some ways the West, and that the loss of friendship and communion and the agency, thinking various novels here, a sense that the world is biology working itself out, that's all there is the loss not only caused by the loss of faith in the West, but is in the end, in some ways, the rejection of the Christian heritage. He doesn't seem himself quite able to re-embrace the faith, but he knows that there was something there which is needful. And it seems to me the starkest aspect of his fiction is that the needful thing is just life itself. A sense that life is worth having, and that it is not just animals waiting to die, but that it is, he wouldn't put it this way, I don't think, persons from and yearning for communion. That's what I see in the fiction. Oh, please, you must ask questions or I will feel awful.
The counterculture that you're proposing is sounds really delightful and wonderful. It seems so alien to what we live in that if you propose it to some people, they might think you've taken leave of your senses. How is it working out for you personally? I mean, have you seen people starting this kind of life and moving on with it? And you describe your own personal experience. Sounds very good. Have you seen other people been able to come up with this sort of living?
Well, you know how life works, right? You remember the non-mundane moments because most of the moments are relatively mundane. Yeah, I mean, I'm a teacher. I've graded it. I don't know how many tens of thousands of words, which began with, "Since the dawn of time, philosophers have wondered about." You sort of go, "Oh, great," right? It's not always lovely. If any of you know about the John Senior and the program at Kansas, or if any of you, and my friends always make fun of me for how much I love this novel, but if you've read The Awakening of Miss Prim, lovely novel, there is a sense afoot by many that wonder itself would be a restoration of things just now. I remember reading a few years ago about some middle school children who didn't know where food came from. They didn't know that carrots grew in dirt. They were taken to a garden and they were horrified. They didn't want to eat carrots anymore because they didn't know that carrots came from dirt. I have a daughter who loves snakes. I'm terrified of snakes. She loves to catch snakes. She fearlessly reaches in under logs and under rocks and pulls out snakes as I sort of run shrieking away. She's not afraid of the soil or snakes or of dirt. She's seen the stars. She's heard music. These are just human realities accessible to any and all who would have them. The stars are there, the soil is there, nature is there, the museums are there, the music is there. All of these things are there in a way that our ancestors would have died of amazement that are there. They could not have believed that the cultural riches and the comfort available not even to many of the kings and queens are just right there for us. We just have to simply find attention and the kind of childlike wonder to turn to them. And what's in offer in all good things, and remember, all things which are real are good. What's at offer in all good things is some small bits, the wrong word, because God doesn't cast off in bits. But the agency of God is present in those things. Augustine tells us that God is closer to us than we are to ourselves. Thomas will remind us that everything which is does not simply have essence, but also has existence, and that existence participates in the agency of God. It is only because God says, let it be. God is discernible in some way in all of these things. Every effect resembles its cause. It's everywhere if we just looked. Now, my cultural forms and attractions are mine. You may have heard about, papa dancing, which frankly is not my favorite either, and thought, oh, how quaint, how ridiculous. Or, line dancing, and sort of died of embarrassment inside because you couldn't imagine doing that. Fine, you don't have to do that. You can do it in ways which are appropriate to your own form, your own state of life, your own friends, your own community. But what's at offer in it all is something beyond just a good time. Not just a sort of forgetting of the cares of life and work and studies, young children, whatever it is that you're dealing with in life. What's on offer is something like the image of God. It's why the feast or the festival is so delightful, because it's done for its own sake out of a kind of generosity and tokens forth something like the life of God. Why would we not embrace that? The great image of this, of course, is the Eucharist itself.
Thank you for your talk. This was wonderful and a lot to sit with. One thing I was hoping that you could elaborate upon was you were talking about isolation, and I think in particular, though, unforgiveness is a source of isolation in community. Unforgiveness.
Yes, thank you.
And so I was kind of hoping that you could kind of speak into that, because I think when we think of keeping the Sabbath and bringing in communion, it's easy to think about the joy and kind of forget or obliterate the fact that there are messy relationships and things that are wrong, and not simply a matter of not being called forth, but like having blocked away from it. So I was hoping that you could actually speak about unforgiveness and that kind of isolation, and how the Sabbath in particular, and how communion can draw from the active choice to resist.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, this will be an incomplete answer. There'll be more to it than this. Because in some ways, we're not talking just theory. We're talking about the particular experiences of this person blocked from family or blocked from friends. And you can't answer that in the abstract. Right? You have to answer that in the concrete. But it's no accident that on the table where the bloodless sacrifice, which is a sacrifice, is offered, is a crucifix. And it's no accident that above, near, will be reminders of the crucifixion for all. Was it Balthasar who had that great title? I think it was No Bloodless Myth. The goodness of God is inexhaustible. And yet the goodness of God is offered to us through the sacrifice of the second person in Jesus. We're preparing for the holy days ahead of us, where that sacrifice then becomes something of the opportunity, occasion, regeneration of all new life, all new forgiveness, all capacities for we who are baptized to live the life of Christ to all. I'm so intrigued. I haven't read it for a while, but a few years ago I was transfixed by the works of Irenaeus. Irenaeus is this funny theory, funny in the sense of, I thought it was just intriguing, unusual. I hadn't known it before. He asked the question somewhere, how old will Jesus be in heaven? It's a strange question. I can't remember his answer, but it's something like 82, or it's elderly anyway. Well, why? Because Jesus recapitulates the human story. He's born as we are. He dies as we die. He grows in wisdom and stature. He has friends. He weeps. He hungers. He thirsts as we do. And he rises again as we will. He also retells the story of Israel. flees to Egypt. He's in the desert for 40, crosses the Jordan, etc. Jesus is retelling, as it ought to be told, the human story and the covenantal story. And that story is a story of forgiveness. But it's not a bloodless forgiveness. He must sacrifice. Now, I can't say this in the abstract or the general, like, you must go based on the wounds that you have and sort of just sacrifice yourself and offer forgiveness. I don't know. That may be unwise or imprudent in the context and the situation. But as a form of the Christian life, forgiveness comes at a cost, and there is no rehabilitation or recapitulation of communion without some form of sacrifice. For us, because we are not God, giving of ourselves always comes, in a sense, at a kind of diminishment. Time, maybe. Resources, attention. I think it redounds back. But the Father can give endlessly to the Son and lose nothing. We give and we suffer in the giving. And yet that seems to be the call. It's abstract, but I think the truth is in that direction. But certainly you're correct. It's not simply a story of happy joy all the time. But it is a story of joy.
You gave slight reference to COVID and the lockdowns, but as I think back to this last year, I feel like we've gone in a direction of isolation and a rejection of community that has gone beyond just fear of physical safety. I see it with so many people my generation who have the least to fear from a health standpoint of COVID, but who are more eager to lock themselves up and lock down than many in older generations. Do you feel like there's something quantitatively different or qualitatively different about what this past year has done to our alienation, and do you think it's going to resolve on its own, or are there additional steps that we need to take to restore community in the wake of this?
Yeah, thank you. Prudence allows for various judgments to be made about was this the proper step, lockdowns, quarantines, masks, etc. Prudence allows for some disagreement. I have my opinions on about those sorts of things, which I, on the advice of my wife and attorneys, will not share. More of my wife than my attorneys, because I don't have attorneys, but my wife has told me to not give my opinions about such things anymore. Anymore. I remember reading a few years ago about cuddle parties. You ever heard of these? People who are so desperately lonely that they go to groups of strangers and they form kind of cuddle circles. They're not sexual. It's forbidden. You just cuddle with strangers. Why? Because they have no connection. They have no real friendships. They have acquaintances. They are elementary particles, in Willebeck and Lilla's phrase. You can't but imagine that for many, not all, that situation is exacerbated now after the last year, because it was already the reality for so many people. And in fact, we are used to it, so many of us. We're disposed to it for so many of us. In fact, we think of that as autonomy and as liberty. We've become utterly convinced, I think, that what it means to be free is to be disentangled and unencumbered, to not have responsibilities. I can't tell you how many young men sit in my office and say, but I mean, I'd like to get married, she seems lovely, but I want to be free. Well, they wish to be unencumbered. They believe liberty is to be an elementary particle in your own space, rotating around your own orbit, going in your own trajectory. That's not liberty in the Augustinian sense. We have an enormous opportunity in the communions and communities of our parishes, feeble as some of them are in their understanding. I'm a convert to the faith. I remember many people telling me when I told them with great joy I was coming into the Catholic Church, the most common joke I got was, "Come on in, the water's terrible." I will admit my parish experiences have not always been delightful. Sometimes they're a little dry. Sometimes I think of my Baptist days and wonder, why will no one in this whole parish look me in the eye? Could no one say hello? How long would I have to go to this parish before anyone would invite me to lunch? or acknowledge that I'm here. This is all plain off caricature here, but you know, the Mid-Atlantic is the Mid-Atlantic. I'm Canadian, I'm still stunned by it all. Despite the feebleness of some parishes, I'm told this parish is incredible. Despite the feebleness of some parishes and the limits of human nature where we are afraid to give of ourselves, we're afraid to offer, we're afraid to act out of love, ordinary human things, the Catholic Church remains a sheer, massive fact. It's here. There are people here. The parishes are open when many other congregations and other ecclesial communions have been closed. We're here. At every hour of every day, there's a tabernacle in the world offering the sacrifice. We're just here as a fact. The sheer objective reality of the Catholic Church, the body of Christ on earth. We have the good fortune of being animated and enlivened by the Holy Spirit. So, what can we not do?
To kind of go along with what you were saying here, so here in DC, many of us have left our families, so we've kind of made the choice to be like, kind of have this atomistic lifestyle. We also don't, many of us here, I'm guessing, don't have families either. And so do you have like specific perhaps advice for how to apply? Because I feel like a lot of the things you said are very, like they're better lived out in a family context. So should we seek out families to like kind of join like temporarily, or should we seek out to, you know, live in larger houses with more people in them? Or is it wrong to live the way we do and we should actually leave? What's your
You can't say that, because every Catholic I know in the country at one point says, I think I'm going to move to Arlington or Alexandria because things are so good there. There's an essay, I forget, the author is totally escaping me. There's an essay written a few years ago by some British in a British newspaper talking about somebodies and anybody's. You remember this? Do you remember this at all? We have been trained, the denizens of the modern West, to be anybody's. And anybody's live anywhere, right? So they come from a small town in this place and they go to DC to go to Georgetown so that they're ready to go to the London School for Economics, so that they're ready to have the year in Hong Kong, so that they can end back up in DC for the internship, so they can end up in, you see the point. That's an anybody living anywhere. But most of us, by nature, are actually desiring to be somebodies from somewhere. We don't want to be anonymous. We'd like to have the benefits and challenges of real community where somebody knows that we are somebody. Now, many of you will be, given the state of life, young professionals and so on, you'll be more like anybody's than somebody's just now. How many of you do not live within 5 to 10 miles of your parents? How many of you do not live between 10 and 50 miles of your parents? How many of you do not live between 50 and 150 miles? Yeah, it's all the same people, right? Many of you have come here for things. That's okay. I don't think you need to break down the nuclear family and form extended family pods. I don't think you need to live in communes. You can, that's fine. You can find friendship. You can have someone over for Sunday lunch. That's it. It's all easily available. You just have to act. There's no magic formula. There's no necessary form that it needs to take. You just have to act.
Thank you very much. Always like hearing from a fellow convert. So my question, just kind of going back to just current climate as well, you know, with the talk of community and all this, and I think this problem we have with conversation these days, how do we get better at that? But especially like even today, I feel like within the church itself, there's, you know, division within the church. How do we start to take this approach that you're talking about this evening and start to even do some mending within the church and within our Catholic communities to then hopefully, you know, take that further.
Yeah, thanks. There are two words which are both sort of beautiful words, but used too often in the wrong context. One becomes somewhat allergic to them. One is community, and the other is dialogue. You sort of hear them, you think, oh no, I need to dialogue again, which means I will say nothing, they will say nothing, and we'll leave without knowing anything about each other. There is something remarkable. My friends tease me for my affection for an image, I think a remarkable image, from John Courtney Murray. That what it means to have a kind of community is to have a conspiracy, con, with, spire, to breathe, to breathe with. You remember being a child and being transfixed by some object, something silly, like you find the firecrackers, or you find the dead bird, or you find the interesting looking rock, and you and your friends sort of huddled together, very close, breathing the same air? That's a conspiracy. There is something about the dialogue which is very similar to that. The back and forth. Back and forth, of course, assumes that you are willing to grant the possibility that the other has reasons for their position or their action. It doesn't mean you have to accept them, and it doesn't mean you can't reject those reasons. But it does assume that the giving of reasons and the challenging of those reasons is not a mark of disrespect, but in fact a mark of the recognition of equality. We're speaking beings, we're reasoning animals. Rational animality and social animality go together. We're rational animals, and as such, we can speak and reason together. We're rational animals, and thus we are political beings as well. That depends upon the ability to grant and to allow the other to grant to us that the challenging of reasons and positions is a recognition of fundamental human respect and equality. That'd be a big accomplishment if we could do that. But it means that kind of listening Socratic ear, which in the words of, I'm going from Socrates to Ignatius of Loyola. Ignatius, somewhere at the beginning of the exercises, says, interpret what the other says as orthodox, as if it is as orthodox as possible. And if not, interpret it better for them. Charity is not simply a kind of tolerance of live and let live. Charity is the desire to will the good of the other and to will union with the other. That's what charity is. To will the good for the other and to will union with the other. And that requires all of these things: forgiveness in the face of wrong, argument in the face of difference, recognition in the sense of, in the context of alienation, communion when it is not present. That's not easy to be done. I'm not pretending any of those words solve anything. Those are agenda items, not solutions. And yet, that's the direction. Please.
Thank you for your phenomenal talk, Dr. Snell. My question is, how does the joy that one can partake in on the Sabbath, how does that translate into the busyness of the week? In the midst of work, in the midst of late nights and everything like that, when although we might be with others, we might not necessarily have the time to share a meal all the time? Or how does the more spiritual aspect of these earthly acts translate to the week and kind of make our entire week holy in that way?
I'm smiling because I thought what you were going to say is not, oh, we don't have time to be with others, but sometimes I have to be with these others, which is its own, its own issue. I remember when I was first learning Catholicism and running into Catholics, and you'd hear Catholics of a certain age say, offer it up, in the context of anything being unpleasant. Offer it up. What does that mean? I just want it to go away. What does that mean, offer it up? I still don't really get it, right? Or mortify your senses. What does that mean? I don't know what that means. Why won't they tell me anything? And yet there is something about that which is profoundly true. If the source and summit of the Christian life is the Eucharist, like that which is the grounding of our sanctification, and in some ways, just now, the perfection of communion that we have available will be transcended at some point. It's offered every day. You may not be able to go today, but you can make spiritual communion today, which is in some ways not perfect, but real, maybe not ontologically real, like receiving itself, but real in intention, communion with the source and summit of the Christian faith, and with the life of God, which is an endless outpouring of love and joy. And from the standpoint and recognition and participation in the endless outpouring of joy, and in a recognition and knowledge that you are adopted into the life of God, where what was his, what is Christ is now yours, his righteousness is now yours, his life is now yours. You've been baptized into his life, into his death and resurrection. Everything can be offered up. Jesus had a very quiet and long earthly ministry that we think not about. We think about the short, intense period of the earthly ministry. Most of his earthly ministry, which was redemptive in and of itself, was him doing the ordinary things that you do. And that is part of the drama of salvation. That is part of the drama of the God-man working out our salvation and recapitulating the human story. You do the same.
Hi, thank you. So I love this sort of concept of like outjoy the culture. But we, oftentimes the culture focuses on like just feeling good, like seeking earthly pleasures. You mentioned like dancing in a nightclub is not what you're talking about. Why do you think that is so different? Like the idea of dancing in the context of like a nightclub versus dancing on the Sabbath, why do you think it's so different in the results that it gets?
Have you been to a nightclub?
Yeah. So from that context, I get it, but just, yeah.
So as I recall nightclubs, a few years ago, I was taking a bunch of students to, we were on like a field trip. These college students were on like a field trip. We went to the symphony, and I was taking them to lunch. And there's this fancy restaurant in downtown Philly that had an ancient old jukebox, like mechanical arm that would come over and get the 45s, like 1932. And one of the students said to me, "Is that how you listen to music when you were a kid?" I'm like, oh. I do remember going to nightclubs. As I recall them, there's a floor like this, with all the women in the middle and all the men on the outside. Well, if any of you know T.S. Eliot, you know that I was riffing on Eliot, on the story of the dance. Man and woman, arm in arm, in a commodious sacrament matrimony. Communal dance is a story of tradition because it's the community's formation of the eros of its young and the celebration of the eros of those who are married and the blessing of that eros by the church and the consecrated who do not participate in a direct way but nonetheless approve of the communion. Communal dancing is a story of tradition. That's different than the hunt. It could not be more distinct. The handing off of partners in tradition is not the handing off of elementary particles who have banged together. It is the handing off of a story. Could not be more distinct from each other. And one is utterly a source, in the end, of joy. Because it's the story of normalcy, the way of God and his words. Or too simple?
No, that's great. Thank you.
Well, so I hope this evening bears much intellectual and spiritual fruit for this community, and maybe even a dance craze, of which I approve as a cleric. So on behalf of the Thomistic Institute and St. Charles, please join me in thanking Dr. R.J. Snell.
If you cannot yourself play music, there is I believe now 2 very fine albums you could listen to. Thank you all.